President Lee Jae Myung voices hopes of starting a new phase in partnership between Seoul and Beijing based on trust at the summit level, while his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping highlights the importance of making the right strategic choices amid the current climate of geopolitical instability. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Tuesday, January 6th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we delve into the latest summit-level discussions between South Korea and China and their broader implications amid dramatic developments in the international arena. For more on this, I have Fabian Kretschmer with German press agency here in the studio, DPA that is. Fabian, welcome back.
Great to be here.
I also have Thomas Maresca with the American news agency UPI in the studio with us. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Right, Fabian, let's start with remarks by President Lee Jae Myung and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping amid their second summit back on Monday in Beijing. What did they say and why is it significant?
Yeah, I would say it's quite significant. Let me just give you a brief context. It was their second meeting in only 2 months. So they met here in Korea during APEC summit, and now they have a proper bilateral summit in Beijing. And yeah, the atmosphere was very friendly, all smiles, so to speak. Lee Jae Myung also brought some like traditional painting as a gift. There was one interesting anecdote that the Xiaomi smartphone that Lee Jae Myung got gifted in South Korea during their meeting, now he brought to China and they made a selfie. So you can see the effort that both really want to improve the relationship. And what did Lee Jae Myung say? He said that the summit would be an important opportunity to make 2026 the first year of full-scale restoration of Korea-China relations. And you have to know that under Yoon Suk-yeol, China-South Korea relationship was really suffering. And Lee Jae Myung made it a priority to restore it. The main talking points were that Lee Jae Myung wants to bring back peace on the Korean peninsula. So that, of course, is an important topic for South Korea. And he did not really prominently mention denuclearization, but basically he wants to get China engaged in the peace process with North Korea, get it back on the table. And yeah, I think he wants in general more cooperation. That's what Lee Jae Myung said. And that specifically also stretches to cultural exchange. I mean, there was never an open boycott. It was not an official boycott, but since 9 years, like South Korean bands have not received any licenses for concerts in China. There was not really like dramas that could be streamed in China. So South Korea really hopes that the cultural exchange will happen again. Xi Jinping also made some interesting remarks. I will only say one quote. He said that Seoul and Beijing should stand on the right side of history and make correct and proper strategic choices. And this, of course, you can interpret that right now with geopolitical polarization, China wants South Korea to be closer to China and distance itself a little bit more from the US. So really interesting times that we're living in. And the significance is, of course, that right now, the backdrop of what we're seeing with the US, the attack in Venezuela, of course, there are geopolitical changes. And I think that's a chance for China to get traditional US allies here in the region closer to them.
Right, and before we delve deeper into that, Thomas, what were your takeaways from this latest summit between the leaders of South Korea and China?
Yeah, I was going to say, as Fabian mentioned, it's interesting to see this taking place amid this backdrop of all of this geopolitical volatility, because you can sort of see the positions are kind of almost changing a bit, like in reaction or real time to all these other things going on regionally and globally. But I think also, as Fabian mentioned, it seemed to come off reasonably well and cordially from both sides. And I think, from the Lee Jae Myung side, this does follow with his more pragmatic approach to international relationships in general that he's taken since the start, and he's trying to sort of bring South Korea back to this more of a balance, whereas his predecessor Yoon Suk-yeol had really aligned much more firmly on the Washington side in this kind of superpower struggle. Lee Jae Myung's kind of trying to go back to this position of, walking the line of the U.S. security alliance, but maintaining this strong economic, interdependence with China. And I would just maybe add on from the Chinese perspective too. It comes at a somewhat opportune time. I mean, in some ways, to maybe strengthen, relations, or at least try to, have a little bit more presence, or not to say get in between Seoul and Washington, but maybe, bring itself a little bit closer to Seoul. And that comes at a time when China is in the midst of its own diplomatic sort of row with Japan, so there could be a sense of China looking to have a regional partner that can kind of offset its current diplomatic spat with Japan as well. So I mean, I'm not sure what I think the practical takeaways, they did sign a number of agreements in terms of economic cooperations, and also, as Fabian mentioned, there's some talk of bringing back some cultural exchanges, which would be in the interest of South Korea to export its K-pop and K-culture. I mean, North Korea, obvious issue for engagement. Again, there's just kind of in this stage of discussing it. I mean, Beijing has an important influence on Pyongyang, and certainly South Korea would like to see that some form of engagement growing there. But I think just in general too, resetting the relationship and agreeing to have more meetings to put this back on the calendar is probably the biggest and most important takeaway.
Right. Fabian, speaking as a German journalist, what issues addressed by the two leaders of South Korea and China may have been of interest to their counterparts in Europe, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Europe right now has a lot on its table, a lot of problems, so there's not much focus maybe, or as it should be here towards this region. But I mean, I think many of the aspects that were talked between those two leaders are of interest for Europe. Europe wants security in the region. That's, I think, one of the main priorities. And when Lee Jae Myung and Xi Jinping talk about how peace can be brought to the Korean Peninsula, or potentially a denuclearization, or how there might be more stability, that is good for Europe. The second point I want to mention is the business interest. I mean, Europe has a lot of interest towards they want to secure their supply chains in the region. South Korea is manufacturing a lot for European companies. China, much more so even. So everything that is supporting business stability, the status quo of economic relations, or improvement of economic relations, I think is also good for Europe. And then there were some statements towards multilateralism. I think we delve into that later a little bit. That is also a strong signal. I think what Europe wants to see is that countries should adhere to the rules-based order. And I mean, you might argue, does China really do that? But I mean, that's maybe a different question. But in terms of rhetorics, I think that there was a good sign that both countries, South Korea as well as China, position themselves as we want the rules-based order. And maybe one specific aspect, the geopolitical positioning of South Korea between the US and China is also of interest for Europe, because European countries are middle powers, just as South Korea. So they can maybe learn how to adjust, how to maneuver in this geopolitical polarization, how to basically hedge all the risks and become more independent between a more challenging China and also a US that is also changing and evolving. Yeah.
Right, and speaking about the US, Thomas, speaking as an American journalist, what topics during the talks between President Lee Jae Myung and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping might be of interest to the Trump administration, keeping in mind its foreign policy, do you think?
Right, there are definitely a few areas. I think, probably in the broadest sense, just kind of looking to, trying to gauge whether this, dialogue, the Seoul-Beijing dialogue is in any way kind of seeing Seoul drifting more towards Beijing. Is it doing anything that would kind of weaken the U.S. leverage in the region, or anything that's at the expense of the U.S.-South Korea alliance is kind of probably the biggest picture they're looking at. And I think, maybe one of the biggest areas is probably this kind of supply chain red line in a way. I mean, this is a huge, piece of the U.S.-China kind of, battle for supremacy and this, this economic and technology cooperation. And, Washington, it happened before Trump as well, but, have taken this hard line with, supply chains, export controls, advanced technologies. And so, we know, Lee Jae Myung brought all of the business leaders along with him. Samsung is there, LG, and et cetera. And we know there's discussion and some agreements about supply chains and cooperation perhaps in some of these areas. So I think the U.S. officials are going to be very concerned or will scrutinize whether can South Korean firms become kind of conduits for technology leakage, or somehow, some access to advanced South Korean semiconductors. So I think in those areas, the U.S. would have a strong interest. Obviously anything with North Korea is probably going to perk up the ears in Washington. Whether China will somehow get involved or exert more influence over Pyongyang or anything about, sanctions enforcement or stabilizing the Korean Peninsula, I think they would certainly keep an eye on. And just perhaps, other, what kind of concessions might South Korea be making, to improve economic relations? There's, on the security front, obviously the THAAD missile defense deployment here created a big schism between South Korea and in Beijing back in 2016 or 2017. Now South Korea is going to develop nuclear subs, which Seoul has pointed to as a chance to exert greater observation and range within the region. So is that something that China will try to push back on and say, so I think that, some of those security issues may be tied to these kind of economic cooperations is another thing.
And beyond the bilateral summit and security issues addressed perhaps in Beijing, President Lee Jae Myung also has a rather busy agenda over in Shanghai. Could you tell us a bit about his schedule in that Chinese city and its significance?
Yes, there are two aspects. One is economic and one is historic. Let me start by the economic aspect. Lee Jae Myung is in Shanghai visiting a startup venture conference between Korea and China, and that makes sense because Shanghai is the business city of China. And I think the business relation between China and South Korea, the whole dynamic has changed quite a bit, as it has changed also with other, let's say, European countries. For example, my home country as well. That back in the days, China was mainly a big market, and South Korean companies were producing superior products and selling them there. But now the Chinese competitors have really increased their game and are level on. So I think now it's also South Korean companies who have a strong interest to learn from Chinese companies. And I think Lee Jae Myung, he has a bold vision to establish South Korea as an AI powerhouse. And I think in those business conferences, he will also get some insight from Chinese companies. Actually, the second part of his agenda in Shanghai I found even more interesting. He's visiting the provisional government in exile, the historic building where Korean independent activists, politicians in exile during the time when Korea was under Japanese colonial rule, they declared their own government in exile. That's a building hidden in Shanghai, in the old alleys, in the historic area of the city, and you wouldn't even find this building if you wouldn't know where to look for it. It's kind of nondescript. It's very interesting. I've visited it myself several times, and a small building, maybe 3 stories high, where the Koreans were establishing the government in exile just 100 years ago. A fascinating chapter of history, and it shows the deep relationship between Korea and China. But let me add, that was not under communist China. I think the People's Republic of China at that time did not exist, so it was actually the Republic of China, the government who then later, after the Civil War, fled to Taiwan.
Right. And speaking about that, Thomas, keeping in mind the Trump administration's recent capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro from his country this past weekend, quite a number of observers fear that that particular event may offer China the perfect pretext for an assault against Taiwan. What have you been hearing on the ground, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think everyone has, or many people have made the sort of, observation that, this gives China the kind of pretext, or at least gives China the opportunity to kind of call out the U.S. own hypocrisy or flouting of international laws that that the U.S. has often used against China in the past. We've certainly seen this kind of expressed already within Chinese media and Xinhua news agency, or an English language Chinese daily. I was reading an article, basically saying U.S. has crossed a line in the post-war international order, has violated the U.S. Charter and basic norms. So it's really the language that the U.S. has often used to criticize moves by China or by Russia, which has also kind of weighed in on this. So in a sense, it really does undercut the kind of moral authority that Washington has at least been able to use, and kind of turns the tables in a way. But at the same time, a lot of analysts that I've sort of seen and heard from and spoken to one or two just informally, don't believe it suddenly is going to accelerate China's plans for Taiwan. And I mean, one of the main reasons is that China has always portrayed their desire to claim Taiwan as a purely internal affair. It's never really framed it in the sense of anything applying to international law, and beyond that, though, I think just really China's time frame has so much more to do with when it feels like it could seize and control Taiwan, based on its own military capabilities. I think, some people have pointed out, if China could just seize Taiwan tomorrow, they would probably do it. I mean, not worrying about what the kind of international laws might say about it, and again, they portray it as a completely internal affair. So they're much more, I think, time frame has to do with when they think they can possibly do it. And for now, I mean, have been using these kind of gray zone tactics, trying to wear down Taiwan, and trying to make it seem sort of inevitable that this will eventually happen. So there's a sense of, time is on their side. So I don't think this really moves their time frame in any way. And it also doesn't present like a good pure analogy for what they might want to do. It's not like going in and seizing the Taiwanese president, Lai Ching-te, is like really would help them in their goal. I mean, it's kind of a different scenario. But it does, again, with this maybe the longer term picture, offer a kind of justification or change the narrative that the U.S. is flouting international law with this kind of might makes right justification. It kind of makes it harder for anyone to call out China or Russia. I think, it's also just a couple other things quickly. Within China, though, it's been interesting to see there's been a lot of response on social media, public relations, and a lot of voices have kind of looked to this and, comparing the Venezuela operation and saying, this is how we should deal with Taiwan. Like sort of social media is saying, oh yeah, this is what we should do, and kind of building up. So it may help build up this kind of domestic sense of, oh yeah, this is what we should be doing. We should be following what the U.S. did in this case. And just a very last thing, I saw some coverage from within Taiwan saying that, some Taiwanese officials are actually looking at this Maduro capture more as a deterrent to China, like an example that the U.S. is not afraid to go out and do something dramatic in another region, and it does sort of show their capability. So that's another voice that's kind of popped up.
Right, one way to look at it then.
Yeah.
Fabian, with regard to the U.S.'s actions against Venezuela, how does that look to affect perhaps its peace plan for Ukraine against Russian aggression?
Yeah, I think it has a negative influence. I mean, the US has only a certain amount of diplomatic resources. Now they are focusing on totally different regions. So for Europe, anyone who hoped that Trump would get involved stronger in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, at least for now, I think is disappointed. And in general, the long-term effect, as Thomas has mentioned, it's highly problematic because Trump is giving a justification to all the authoritarian regimes, such as Moscow. I mean, in Putin's worldview, he feels that, I knew it. It's a jungle out there. It's a Darwinistic world where only the strongest will survive. If you want to have power, you have to take it by force. There's no such thing as institutions or a free order. I think you just take it if you're military powerful enough. And I think in his point of view, in Putin's point of view, he thinks that, okay, Ukraine is my hemisphere, my backyard. I take it. I don't want any Western influence there, no European Union influence. So that is justified. That's exactly the same logic that Trump applied for Venezuela. So I think it's really very concerning. And I think a lot of things have changed since that attack by the US.
Right. And staying with that attack, Thomas, how does it look to affect perhaps efforts to engage North Korea?
Yeah, again, I think maybe it doesn't, I don't know if it practically changes that much, just in terms of, I think, if Kim Jong-un and Trump see an opportunity to meet again, and if there's some reason that North Korea feels like there's something in it for them to gain, I don't think, Venezuela would stand in the way of that necessarily. And, interestingly, Seoul, I don't think Seoul would, use Venezuela as any kind of pretext. It's sort of, actually, allies have, especially here, I think in Asia or, South Korea and Japan have been very sort of circumspect in criticizing it. Actually, the much stronger condemnations have come from North Korea, from China, from Russia. And I was going to say, so maybe practically, I don't know if it really changes the kind of, because it's the transactional nature that already has existed between Trump and Kim Jong-un. But, North Korea also just very quickly seized on this as a way to condemn, what Washington did, and, to also bolster its own claims for having a nuclear deterrent. I mean, they, as I'm sure you covered, they fired some hypersonic missiles not long after Trump announced that they had captured Maduro. And Kim Jong-un, specifically pointed to this kind of geopolitical crisis as a justification for the weapons test, not mentioning specifically. But North Korea's foreign ministry condemned the rogue and brutal nature of the U.S., calling it a hegemon and violating international law and the UN Charter. And this just very much sort of strengthens Pyongyang's argument that, their entire nuclear weapons program is meant to be a deterrent to the threat of the U.S., with its troops in South Korea and these joint military drills as plans for an invasion. And, it always has seemed like self-serving kind of hyperbole, but actually, this is probably one of the first really concrete examples they, can point to and look at as saying that this is an example of the U.S. doing what we're claiming they always do. And, a lot of people have just pointed out that what happened in Venezuela just further underlines the rationale for states to have their own nuclear arsenals. Nukes are seen as essential for regime survival in a lot of countries, and people point to Iraq, Libya, even Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. So there is this kind of cautionary tale about it that does sort of lend credence to the idea that we could see more reason for nuclear proliferation, a more sort of dangerous world emerging. I don't think that denuclearization in North Korea was really going to be on the table in any sort of substantial way, even if they met now. But it seems hard to kind of make the argument to them against having nuclear weapons, at least in the kind of current context.
Right, and probably we'll be talking more about that in our sessions in the days to come then. All right, Thomas, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Fabian, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow.